We're starting off today by cutting the plywood into the shelf bottoms using the size we determined in the last video. We then cut a 1x4 board down to the same size as the width of these shelves, and what we're going to do is run those through the table saw to create a trim piece on the front so that we don't have exposed end grain plywood on the front of these shelves. We're then going to notch these to fit over the plywood just like we did on the sunglasses shelf. Just like we did for the sunglasses shelf, we're going to cut extra shelf bottoms and extra front trim pieces. This way, if we have an issue and we're assembling them later on, we can just throw them out and start again with a new piece rather than having to go back and cut more. You'll see that this saves us during the assembly. After fitting the front trim piece to the shelf bottom, we're ready to test fit this in the closet. We are back in the closet now. I'm going to put one of these little base caps on just so I have a good sense of how far it is going to stick out. As fitting this, it'll be about right there. And now these black shoes, they're not only one of the widest, they're also one of the tallest pairs I have. Placing it there, how much space do we actually need to get access to it? If you have a friend, this is a really good time to use them. So the height difference between the shelves is going to be actually a little shorter than the shoes themselves because the shoes don't have their highest portion directly underneath the next higher tier. So what that means is I can actually face these less and fit more of them in, which is kind of a good thing. Now, with how many pairs of shoes I actually want to hang, let's see what that means from a cutting wood standpoint. Played around quite a bit with how much space I had in that closet versus how many shelves that I wanted and the spacing on the shelves. What I did is I said, okay, here's the height I want between shelves versus the number of pairs I want to have, and then added on the numbers up here to account for the thickness of the shelves themselves. Measuring the closet space, I had 40.5 inches from one of those side support boards down to the floor. So in order to straddle that sidebar so that it can fit in between shelves, I'm going to have a vertical height of about 6.5 inches per shelf. That's going to make my total shelf height 48 inches. Now it's also going to mean that that one shelf is not going to stick out as far, so I will have to put a shorter pair of shoes on that one shelf specifically. However, I think it's going to be worth the trade for having it at a more accessible height rather than sitting completely on the ground, making it a little bit more of a hassle to get some of the lower pairs off. Now obviously these shelves are not going to be free floating in space. We do need some sort of a side support for them to nail into or screw into, so I'm going to be cutting this down so we have two side supports on the back. Once we do that, I'll cut a few little dummy blocks and that way we have something to nail into. To cut the side rails, I first cut the 1x4 to length and then ran it down the table saw a little bit under the halfway width. That way I could run it through twice and make sure both of the side rail pieces were the same width at the end. I cut a smaller board to the same width and then cut it to length, and this little board is going to connect the two side rails together. One other thing I want to do is add a small flat shelf on the top. That way I can have a small catch-all for things like my wallet, my keys, whatever. I have more boards than I need for the sneaker shelves, so I'm going to cut one of those down and that's going to become my top shelf. I start by cutting one of the shelf bottoms into the size for that top catch-all shelf I was talking about, then cut a trim piece to size for it as well, and after that I take some of the extra material I have kicking around and cut it into those little dummy blocks I was talking about earlier, and you'll see what I'm using these for later on. Next I begin sanding all the pieces using my orbital sander, and in the interest of time I'm not going to show that full process here. However, I put a link to the full time lapse of this build in the description below. Yesterday after the camera died, I did finish sanding all of the wood that I already had cut. I also cut these additional pieces. Because I'm straddling that sideboard that we already have in the closet, I need something else to have a standoff to keep the distance from the wall equal in all parts. So what I did is I took some leftover 1x6 I had from that project. I just did a couple rip cuts down the middle to get everything about the same size. One of these is going to be a top board on the top catch-all shelf. These two are similarly sized. It's going to go behind the door trim if you're going into the closet this way. There's that little gap right on the back side that's about 3 inches, so these will cover that. And then these two slightly shorter ones are just going to be backers at the middle and bottom of the shelf height. That way I can secure it at 3 different locations to the wall. I got to get these sanded. I'm also going to put the pocket holes in everything that's going to hold all the shelving together. After that I'm going to stain everything, and then it should be pretty much good to assemble after that is dry. After sanding off these newly cut pieces, I break out my Kreg pocket hole jig, then go to work making all the pocket holes for the shelving. If you don't have one of these Kreg pocket hole jigs, I actually highly recommend one. This thing is worth its weight in gold. I use it all the time for building. After I finish all the pocket holes off, I move on to the back boards that are going to screw into the wall, and I pre-drill the holes for the screws on those as well. You want to take your time to make sure the holes are properly placed, especially on that top one that's going to be closest to eye level that you're going to see the most often. Otherwise, when the final assembly is done, it's not going to look very even if everything is off kilt. At the end, I take a piece of sandpaper and I go back and deburr all the edges of the holes I've drilled. Then we're going to move on to staining everything. Now, I've already done a do-it-yourself video on how to stain wood. I'll put a link to that in the description below, as well as the full time-lapse build, and then we'll jump ahead for this video. The wood is now all stained. I'm going to give it a few more minutes to dry. After it's dry, I'm going to pull it all up, get it inside where I can assemble it. And then because this can is just about dead anyway, I'm going to continue pouring it over the top and just stain the rest of this workbench. And then that way I'll have one color instead of a conglomerate of different finishes after doing a project in different sections. Anyhow, let's let it all sit for a few minutes and then we'll resume the project later.